for August 24th, 2023. We operate under the Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 131, Section 40, the Wetlands Protection Act, and Chapter 26 of the Town of Danvers General Bylaws, the Wetlands Protection Bylaw. After each applicant presents his or her request and a board has had time to ask questions and discuss the project, we will accept questions from the audience. Because this is a public meeting, it is required by law that you give your name and address first. Although we may disagree on the issues raised, all persons present during this meeting are expected to be civil to all other meeting attendees. This includes the members of the commission, staff, abutters, concerned citizens, property owners, and project applicants. We also request that you confine your questions to the project and only as it pertains to the Wetlands Act. We cannot handle, nor do we have jurisdiction over matters such as noise or traffic. All problems not related to the Wetlands Protection Act and the Town of Danvers Wetlands Protection Bylaw must be taken up with the other appropriate boards. First order of business will be a roll call. Peter Wilson is present. Vanessa Curran.
Present.
Jonathan Garies.
He can't make it tonight. He called me earlier today.
Okay. Mary Haight, who's our alternate, is not here. Ann McGill.
Present.
And Michael Splain.
It's here.
All right, the first order of business is a request for a certificate of compliance for 4 Hidden Place, DEP file number 14-0833. I think, Georgia, you're gonna give us just a summary of the...
Yeah. And I did want to just add a small correction. So in the memo, I had this photo up here that the commission saw, and I had pointed out the only deviation was the location of the mechanicals over here in the back right, or the back left. That is actually where they were originally proposed. This plan here was an amendment plan to add other features, which were the shed was not added, and the propane tank for the pool heater is where it should be. So everything looks great. I went out to the site earlier this week and met the homeowner in the back. I had no concerns, no issues. The site's actually surrounded by a pretty high retaining wall, so there's good separation between the wetlands and the usable lawn space. So I had recommended the commission issue a certificate of compliance if they are satisfied.
So the property is higher than the surrounding wetlands?
Yes. Yeah, I think in some areas it gets up to like 6 feet tall. Yeah.
Okay, so everything looks good to
Yes.
your practice eye.
Yeah.
Okay, Mike, any questions?
No questions?
Vanessa, any questions?
No.
Ann, do you have any questions?
No questions.
Okay, just one quick question. Where is Hidden Place?
Do you mind going up? Do you mind just going up to the mic and saying your name, just for the record? I said the same thing when she called me.
I know. It's Mary Messina for Hidden Place, and it is off of Green Street to Pasture to Hidden.
You're coming down from Center, it's on your
Center to
left.
Green, how it turns
Okay.
There's
into
a little
green.
development
All right.
there. Yeah.
All right, I know what you mean. Okay, good. This is not a public hearing, correct? So,
Nope.
okay, so if no one's got any questions or any objections, let's have a motion to...
I'll make a motion that we issue a certificate of compliance for 4 Hidden Place, DEP file number 14-0833, applicant Anthony and Mary Messina.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, you're all set. Next time,
Where are you
don't wait so
moving
long.
to? Tell Anthony to look me up before he moves, will you?
All right, our next piece of business is Georgia's going to give us a presentation over some proposed regulation changes that we will, more or less, this is just for information purposes tonight. We'll learn from it, and then pending any questions or major changes that we would want, Georgia and Chris are proposing we vote on this at the end of September.
Yeah.
Are we gonna, we're gonna do that before we vote on the minutes? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
You
You want
can't
to,
leave
yeah.
that soon, Mike.
I'm happy you're eager to vote on them, though.
Oh, well, I actually read everything.
Okay, so I have a feeling the commission knows who I am, but those at home, I'm Georgia Pendergast. I am in the planning department, and I staff the Conservation Commission. We have one gentleman in the audience here. Thank you, Bill, for coming. I have about 18 slides. I won't keep it too long. And I'll preface that I gave this an abridged presentation to the River Committee last week. Not for them to officially vote on anything, but I did get some good feedback from them based on their experience. Actually, a lot of them live on the river and own piers, so it was pretty helpful. So really what brings us here is that we already have pier regulations in our bylaw. The commission actually adopted them. I have a brief little timeline here. It was October 2020 that we had adopted pier standards, and we put that officially into our bylaw and our regulations. But to step back a bit, I just wanted to give the commission a little overview of where things have been adopted and when. So 1988 was actually is when the town adopted to have their own bylaw. About 60% of towns in Massachusetts have their own bylaw. You do not need to have your own bylaw. Some function with just the Wetlands Protection Act. For example, Middleton is one of those, so they don't have a means or ways to implement a 35 or a 25 or more stringent performance standards. And then 1999, actually 11 years later, is when the regulations were adopted. So you can have a bylaw and no regulations. Our bylaw says what the rule is. Our regulations tell us how to implement that rule. So our regulations are actually much longer than our bylaw. Our bylaw is pretty thin compared to our regulations. So I'd say from 1999 to 2020, we really kept with the same language, the same requirements. But 2020 is really when we had an overhaul, so to say. The whole thing was completely rewritten. If the commissioner remembers reviewing that, that's when the 35 and 50 came in, and also the minor project permit. And we updated our fees, because those were going back to 1999, and we definitely could have afforded some more money there. And then in the past couple years, so April 2021, we included the waiver requirements, and then in November, that's when the last change we made was, Mike had actually touched on this at the last meeting, limited projects are exempt from the 35 and 50. That's when that standard came into play. So since 1988, we've made some changes. I would say our biggest ones were in 2020, and that's where their pier regulations came in. And now, for this time around, Chris and I are proposing just some standard conditions. A lot of them are already required in Chris's general letters, recommendations for the commission to adopt. And we figured, why don't we formally put them into the regulations so people can design their piers around that. And if you guys have any questions, just feel free to stop me, because it's really just us here, so nothing too formal. So I wanted to just give a little overview of Danvers. I think we are unique compared to our other waterfront neighbors in Beverly or Manchester or Salem. We don't have a working harbor. I mean, we have a harbor in that we have 5 marinas, we have a lot of boats that are used recreationally, but we don't have a port, so to say. We don't have an economy that brings people here for shellfish or fishing. We really are here for the recreational aspect. I had talked to Chris about getting some numbers of how our waterfront's used, and some of them actually really surprised me. So 700 waterway permits were issued in 2023. So those are applicable if you have a boat over 13 feet and you are spending more than a week here. Your boat is docked for more than a week in Danvers. So say someone comes up from Florida for 3 weeks and they're parking their boat at their friend's pier or they're at the marina, they need to have a waterway permit. So in 2023, we had 700 of those. So that just shows, yeah.
So are those for people that are, those are temporary or visiting? So people that live in Danvers, they don't have those?
So of that 700, I think it's 20% of that 700 were Danvers residents.
Oh, okay.
So it could be people that live in Middleton that are docking their boat all summer, and then they take it out for the winter.
Okay.
Or, like I said, people visiting.
But any boat that's in the water more than, 3 days?
More than a week, more than 7 days.
Needs one of these waterway permits?
Yeah, and you
How long-
apply for that through the harbor master's office.
How long is the permit good for?
That I do not know. I can find out. That's a great question.
I think what's different about Danvers, so we have a lot of riverway.
Exactly.
Longer than most communities.
Absolutely.
But it's all mud flat when the tide goes out, and the other communities have deep water harbors.
Yeah, or they're
and their
right
boats
on
c-
the
yeah.
coast. Yeah, exactly. Like
And
I
I
look
don't
at,
know if our regulations address that or need to. Well, we do with how far off the
Yeah.
flatlands. We have some other issues.
we do, and I think some of those issues may not have a solution. You know, like boats sitting in the mud, we could require everyone have a boat lift, but at some point, we're getting to the point where it's really costly on the average homeowner to have a boat. And I think boats sitting in the mud is something we commonly see all over the place. Even in our other, like Manchester at low tide, I see boats sitting in the water sometimes. But for us, it's addressing a portion of that, which could be the floats. I mean, maybe in 10 years, we'll be talking about boat lifts, or there could be certain scenarios where we think it's important that a homeowner has a boat lift. We've seen one or two of those where they've offered that, but the regulations don't require that, so to say. So, but that's, to that point, we are different in that our tidal influence is a lot different. When we get to low tide, we lose a lot of navigable channel, unlike other communities. And then 2,000 boat launches, I thought that was pretty interesting. So that's the number of boats that came and went out of Pope's Landing off of Water Street, right? Water Street, Liberty Street? Liberty, thank you, Bill. And that's a number from Chris. So anytime someone, that could just be for the day, for a couple hours, that's the number of boats that were put into the water this year. So that just goes to show, I mean, our waterfront is actively used a lot. And there's 133 properties that are on the water, could be considered waterfront. If they were sold, they'd be advertised as waterfront home, and that's including commercial and residential. And of those 133, 45 of them have licensed piers under Chapter 91.
How many have unlicensed piers?
Honestly, about 5 or 6.
Okay.
So it's not too bad. And a lot of, I will say the unlicensed ones were probably licensed 10 years ago under a seasonal 10A permit that the harbor master issues, but Chris has stopped utilizing that program because it's really hard to keep track of, and it's not something we want to encourage. And those are really what you see sometimes off of Water Street or Riverside Ave. It's really just a gangway and a float. It's rare we see piers that are unlicensed. And if they are, they had a license, but it lapsed. I included that in the number.
License is the Chapter 91 license?
Yes, exactly. I don't need to go too in-depth on this one, but I just also want to show the authorities that we deal with in the waterway, or if someone is applying. So the average homeowner is likely gonna have to navigate these 5 areas. And it always starts with us. We are the first ones that people come to through a notice of intent if someone wanted a new pier. And then Chris provides his comment. He'll likely need to issue a permit for that boat or a mooring that's associated with those floats for off-season storage. And then, as you guys know, the Division of Marine Fisheries, they provide comment on anything that impacts a known habitat like shellfish. In front of Tibbetts Ave, we have a lot of shellfish tidal flats. And then, of course, Chapter 91, which I'll get into on the next slide. And then the Army Corps of Engineer. Not all our applicants need Army Corps of Engineer. It really depends on length, but a lot of times that's the last permit they need to get.
What is the Army Corps of Engineers' interest in?
They're interested, if you look at it, it's the navigable waterways of the United States. So really anything that's really impacting that channel beyond mean low water. If you're really getting length beyond mean low water, now you're in the waters of the United States. And so dredging, for example, dredging the channel, mooring blocks, all of those need permits because they're in that navigable waterway.
Well, we're getting people now that came in and they just say we want to be in permanent water.
And they have to get
No.
Army Corps.
So all right.
The last seawall that we had at, was it Liberty Marina, their failing seawall that we just reviewed, the commission
Yeah.
just approved it, they needed to go to Army Corps because they were impacting below mean low water. Because in that area, the low water is actually a lot closer to the bank than you would think. But for some properties, low water goes mean low water is really far out. And people may not have a pier that goes that far out. So Chapter 90, I will say, a lot of the data that I was able to kind of play around with, Chris and I had contracted with Urban Harbor Institute. They're out of UMass Boston. They have a lot of grad students that are looking for projects to work on, mainly coastal based. So we had asked them if they would provide technical assistance on just getting us a list of the property, the Chapter 91 license, and where it's recorded. Because we don't have, someone will call and say, hey, do I have a Chapter 91 license? And I didn't have a list. I would say, well, you have to check the registry, you have to do a title search. And now we have a really nice list of the address, the Chapter 91 license, and when it was issued. And so with that, I can look at the plans, kind of compare the data from 1990 to now, what the piers looked like then, what they look like now. And for those of us that don't know, I really liked this quote: "The Commonwealth's primary tool for protection and promotion of public use of its tide land." So that's really Chapter 91's purpose, is to protect the public's right to access public waters.
So George, the Chapter 91 licenses, are they good for infinity, or do they have a term?
They have a term depending on the license that you get. And I'll get into that into the next slide, but a lot of the license we see are either 15 or 30 years.
Wow.
15 is a simplified license. A lot of times homeowners can actually do those by themselves. It's unlikely they could get through the Conservation Commission application by themselves, but they may not need a Bill Manual or a Bob Griffin to help them with the Chapter 91 application. It's called a simplified permit, and those only last 15 years. And then the general waterway license lasts 30 years. That's much longer.
You say only, but that seems like a long time.
I do say, well, I only say only because we actually have some properties that have 99-year licenses.
Oh,
No,
now,
no,
does that require recording at the registry if it's
Yes.
associated with the land, that
Yes.
particular land?
And you'll read on each license, if you get your license, you get your Chapter 91 license in the mail, and it says, if you don't record this within 60 days, it's void.
Uh-huh.
You can't, it's no longer. So that's the biggest part, is
So
making
are
sure
there
it's
ever
recorded.
instances where someone is selling a piece of property and they think they have a Chapter 91 license and it's not registered properly and they don't?
Yes.
Does the license run with the land? Is it
Yeah.
transferable?
Well, we get into a little stickier part, and I took the slide out, but you guys are asking these great questions. I'm actually going to skip ahead for that question. So in 1990, you'll see at the beginning of the map, Mass DEP, the Waterways Division, is who's in charge of issuing Chapter 91 licenses. And in 1984, 1987, they realized that there's a lot of unpermitted structures in the waterway. So as an incentive to get people to apply for either existing or new structures, they created what's called the amnesty period. So they said, hey, up until 1997, if you guys apply for a structure you already have that's not licensed, we'll make sure the application process is cheaper and the license length is longer. So that was really the incentive to get people to permit their structures. And that's where we really had the most piers permitted, was between 1990 and 1997. Actually, half of our piers were issued in the 90s. And of those, some of them have 99-year licenses, and that was one of the incentives of the amnesty program. But for the 99-year licenses, it's void once you sell the property. So it only runs with the owner.
Yeah, okay.
Or say you have a pier that was permitted in 1995 under the amnesty program, and they awarded 99 years. Now in 2010, you want to make changes to it. License is void. 15 Mead Street, they had a 99-year license. I think they had, I have a picture of it here, but they had like a 60-foot pier and a couple floats, permitted for 99 years, but then the applicant wanted to go really far out. So he now has a 30-year license. So it voids that 99-year license. And then the other one under the amnesty program was typically seen was 30 years. So I think I had a note here. 6 properties in Danvers have a 99-year license. 34 have a 30-year license. And then we have 5 properties that have either 10 or 15 years.
And these aren't commercial licenses, they're only for recreation, right?
Exactly. This is not including any of our marinas or the end of River Street, like the Harbor View condos. I think that's what they're called. Maritime condos, maybe. Some really nice condos. They have 10 slips. So they're technically commercial. They're not a public marina, but I'm not counting them in
Right.
this data.
But they still need it, though.
Yes, they still need a Chapter 91 license, yeah. And the good thing about this was once I started looking at the licensing, I kind of said, how big were the piers back then that were licensed? What were people asking for? What did they want? What was mainly the configuration? And obviously, I think as we've all guessed, that they're growing over time. So half of our license were issued 20 plus years ago. And the length of those piers that are being requested or approved on the licenses are growing. So between 1990 and 2000, the average pier, so it's not including the gangway and the floats, it's just the fixed pier, was 50 feet long. And then in the late 2000s, it's 94 feet long. And then now, what we're seeing, I averaged out at about 124, based on the past ones we've gotten since 2017.
Did the channel change, or the?
No, the channel
Nothing
didn't
like-
change. I really think it's also, homeowners' use. They're wanting to use their boats more, or it's an option now. People realize maybe they have more money to build a longer pier, or they got a nicer boat and they don't want it sitting in the mud. Those are kind of the things at least I was looking at. And then our other numbers, I know a lot of the members have been around here, especially for this end. 2020 was COVID. I think some people were at home wanting to either repair or have a new pier. And then 2006, these guys, that's around when the town had dredged. So I think some people, once the dredging was done, then wanted to put their pier in. So this is what really stood out to me. I said, okay, in less than 5 years, 16 Chapter 91 licenses are going to expire. 5 of them already are. So that kind of tells us and me that we could be getting an influx of people either wanting to renew what they have, which is absolutely fine, or if they're going to renew, they may want to make upgrades. A lot of piers in the 90s aren't going to be as good as they were now. Yeah.
They dredge the channel, they don't dredge the whole river.
Yes.
How often is it dredged? Is it because of the cost, or is it a time period, or what?
I think if we had all the money in the world, maybe we would dredge every 3 years, but it does come down to cost. So I know every town meeting, we set aside funds for dredging. I think that's probably going to be coming up in the next 3 to 5 years, I would say. And that's because we've allocated enough money to do it.
And the channel's filling in.
That collects?
Yeah, and it's the sediment coming out of the rivers too, and then just the tidal influence is bringing more mud in, and then more mud out, and more mud in. So we lose the depth in our channel. Yeah. But yes, only the channel is dredged.
George, I have a question.
Yeah.
So if somebody wants to renew their license, but they're making no changes, they would not have to come to us?
No,
Okay.
that's
Only
right.
if they're expanding?
Yeah, exactly. And
Is there, George, is there some mechanism when their license expires that they're gonna be notified and that they should reapply, or are there chances that people are just gonna let it expire and just let time go on?
I think both. I don't think Chapter 91 is keyed in enough to be issuing letters saying, hey, your license is expiring soon. They put it on the homeowner, which is typical. Sometimes I send reminder letters out for orders of conditions, but I'm not following every single one saying, hey, you only have 3 months left. Hey, you only have 2 months left. So it is on the homeowner. And I've definitely gotten calls from real estate agents that say, hey, I'm selling this property, it has a pier, and I go, yeah, but you should know the license is expired, or they don't even have a license. So whatever you tell the buyer, don't make it seem like they're set, there's some due diligence they'll have to do.
Are you the person to contact for real estate people when a house is changing hands? Is that what they
Yes.
go to for Chapter 91
Yeah.
information?
Usually they come local first, and then I'll say, hey, if there's a waterfront property with no pier, and they say, hey, we want to build a pier, I say hire a consultant, and get through the Chapter 91 process, it's probably going to take about a year, because that's probably how long it takes. I will be honest, I wish real estate agents called me more. I had a real estate agent come in the other day for a waterfront property that had just a gangway and a little float, and I had said, I don't have a permit for that. It most likely had a 10A permit years ago, and it's just, you know. I will preface that with this data, we're not using it for active enforcement. You know, if someone's had that pier for a really long time, right now, at least where we're at, it's not something we're trying to pursue as a violation or enforcement for them to get rid of it or permanent lightly. Maybe that's something we'll do down the line. But I think our first intent was to just gather the data of who does have a license and where are they. Yeah, so this one stuck out to me just to say, okay, I think in the next couple years we're going to have some changes down the pipeline. This is probably what we'll see. So this is a pier that actually the commission approved the improvement to this pier. It's on Riverside Street.
Yeah.
It's Mr. Parker's pier. I don't think he would have any problem with me saying that. But this is a good example of a pier that was approved in the 90s and had a 99-year license to continue. And sometimes they just get in disrepair. If they're not used or they're not maintained, they turn into this. And also the pilings, depending on where they are, they could be around a bend or they just get more tidal influence and they kind of deteriorate. So of the 16 licenses that are almost expiring, there is a chance some could look like this, and the odds of them just wanting to renew that is very unlikely. So I expect some of these homeowners are going to want to upgrade to what we've been seeing, which is this. So we all know this pier on Mead Street, and I thought this was really telling in that, so that's the 1997 approved design. It had a 99-year license, and it has 10 pilings just on this portion. So that's the pier, that's the gangway, and these are the floats, and there's a little houseboat, if you guys remember that little houseboat. So that had 10 pilings, and now what we're seeing, as the commission knows, is aluminum. This one only has 12 pilings. So they really require a third of the less pilings than they needed before. And the length, you're able to get much more length because the aluminum's lighter. I think our last 4 permits or licenses or applications, were aluminum over on Chevalier and Choate. This one, and there's one more.
George, I have a question.
Yeah.
When they go out that far, I mean, is there a consideration for movement of boats up and down the river?
Yes.
So not everyone's going to have one that's long because they may be in the middle of the river.
Exactly. So
Okay.
this is also what kind of sparked us to say, hey, I think we need to put some parameters in here about distance from the channel or how close you can be. So this right here is the channel.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, if you're a kayaker, you could go anywhere here, or
Right.
a swimmer, or if you're on a small vessel. So I will say that did cut out a lot of opportunity for public use. And in Chris's comment letters, where they get kind of vague, but they say, hey, I want the commission to consider outweighing the public benefit for the private benefit. You know, how much are we allocating this private party to have access to the water like he's allowed to, but also we're hindering the public's right. I mean, they can still go through, but not as much as they used to be able to. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But Chris and I did a lot of research. We actually did a lot of math to try to find that perfect regulation. So we had first started with, all right, your property length, you can only go out as far as long as your property's on the water. You know, as much frontage on your lot on the water, that's how far you can go out. Or you have to be 25 feet off the channel. But we found that it really didn't work for a lot of our property. We ran it on a lot of properties, and it's not possible. And especially because our channel is not very defined, especially from low tide to high tide. I mean, at low tide, we could get, it's minuscule. So that really varies how far they go out. So the solution we had was that Chris needs to review and provide comment. So I think the last application request we had on Tibbetts to add more length, Chris's comment was that the commission needs to consider how much this is gonna impact public use, to go out 30 feet more. So there's no hard and fast rule or setback limit right now. What I would love is if we had all the money in the world, I'd love to hire a really good coastal consultant and they flag our navigable channel and we have exact points of where that channel starts in front of each property. And once we have that data, I think we could have a more concrete setback limit. Because even if we did 25 feet from the closest mooring, for some people that mooring's a lot further away or it's a lot closer. So there wasn't a good medium to kind of meet everyone's needs, if that makes sense. All right, so now I'm just gonna roughly review. I know I gave the commission the draft language, and I'm just gonna review it here. And for the last meeting in September is what I'm gonna post the legal ad for, so we're not gonna vote on it tonight. If you did have questions on it, that's great if you wanna ask them. I would encourage you to maybe hold them until the next hearing where the public will be notified and they can attend. This was more of just kind of an overview for you guys about why we're updating our regulations or what we've kind of considered. And I started with the biggest change. This is not in our regulations now, but Chris and I had thought we saw in other communities. So a lot of what I did not really mirror Gloucester or Beverly or Salem or Rockport, because again, their geography and just kind of the state of their waterfront's different than us. But I did find that in the Cape, there was a lot of other communities that had similar tidal influence or kind of river characteristics. So I was looking at Harwich, Orleans, and Barnstable. They had some really good standards on piers. And so the shared piers is one thing I've really noticed a lot among those other towns. And in that, I mean, it's great for us because it reduces the amount of structures in the waterway, but it's still giving private parties public access. So this is definitely something we wanted to encourage. This is actually on Tibbetts, between 17 and 19 Tibbetts. So they have a shared pier. And the incentive there is to say, hey, if someone comes to us for a shared pier, and you'll see later on, one of the regulations says, you know, float size needs to be limited to 200 square feet. That's something Chris has kind of been suggesting in each comment letter. I'm suggesting now that we officially adopt it into the regulations. But the incentive here is if you're doing a shared pier with 2 or 3 people, then you can ask the commission to waive that 200 square feet. And maybe you guys would consider more because there's 3 families sharing one pier and they may need more slips or more float area.
Would it be designed so they could all share it at once? Is that the idea? Is that
Yeah,
what you'd
it
want
could,
it
you
to
know, I
do?
think in that scenario would be another float coming off here and another float coming out here, so you can have 3 boats. I did get some really good feedback at the river committee meeting that I had not considered. In fact, when I pulled this picture up, one of the gentlemen commented that he lived in that house and that he owned that shared pier, but he had since sold it. So he gave me some really good feedback, which I had not considered, but it came down to insurance and liability. I guess he had to get a really big umbrella policy for his insurance. Sharing, you know, if the neighbor had fallen on the pier, they would have to split the cost. There was kind of some cost that was prohibiting them from functioning as well as they wanted it to. And he also noted that you need to have a good relationship with your neighbor if you're going to be sharing.
Obviously, yeah.
Yeah.
What happens if one party sells their property?
So we are requiring that the shared pier will have a deed restriction that basically says the next owner is going to be entitled to that portion of the pier, that share. But that also means that new person can't build a new pier. You know, there can only be one pier for those shared properties.
Be part of the conveyance when they sell the property.
Yes, yeah. And there's definitely more legalities to pick apart with that, but I think here the incentive is to say, hey, if you guys do a shared pier, you may be able to have a little bit more room afloat, or
And the cost savings is
Exactly,
huge. Yeah,
exactly, especially on Tibbetts when those houses are so close together,
yeah.
yeah.
Are we preparing to offer any incentives to encourage people to
Yeah,
go
the,
to shared piers?
That's what she's saying, the square feet.
Well, other than the floats.
Yeah, so in the regulations, it says for people proposing a shared pier, the commission can waive any standards they see fit in this section. So it's not just, any regulation the commission could waive if requested, and if you guys see fit.
So like the 4-foot width and the height above the
Exactly.
salt marsh, we could,
Yes. The height above salt marsh,
Maybe not
that's,
that.
but the width, the pier, the width, maybe 5 feet's
Right.
better. Or having it longer, or the material used, any of those can be waived, so that's the
so
big.
are we just gonna leave that kind of nebulous? If it's a shared pier, you could ask for more square footage, and it'll be up to the discretion of the commission at the time
Exactly.
to approve that. It wouldn't be,
Yeah.
it wouldn't be a limit of, say, 400, because there's 2 people sharing.
Yeah, so that, it kind of opens up the book for negotiation,
You
so
could
to
put
say.
not to exceed, though. You could
Yeah,
put an upper limit.
Yeah.
you could,
Yeah.
but I think it also depends on every property's different, and what they want is always different.
Yeah, okay, I think if we just left it as the discretion of the commission
Yeah,
at the time.
yeah.
I don't
But
think
that
a
way
lot of
they
people
know
go this route,
they can ask for
which is
something.
Too bad.
Yeah.
Okay,
So the placement requirements, a couple things that changed in the bylaw. Again, some of Chris's language, albeit vague, we hadn't had it in there before. So we say now piers cannot encroach upon the channel or mooring areas or areas where people traditionally use for swimming, boating, sailing. So like the one on Mead Street, depending on the tide, people can really swim anywhere, but it's really those traditional areas that Chris is familiar with Will Jose. I've never seen someone swim over there, or like boats cannot go over there. I think if you guys remember on Tibbetts, we had asked to go down a little further, and Chris said, no, I can't even go in there, it's
Yeah,
way
couldn't go in.
too shallow.
Yeah.
So that's kind of an area where if someone were to put a pier out there, it's not gonna be encroaching on a navigable area. Or Jacob's Landing, the last pier that the commission had approved, it went out pretty far, but it was very far from where boats pass by, and it was really far from the nearest mooring ball.
The 15 Jacobs one?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's, the language we're putting there is basically saying, hey, you need to design it so you're not encroaching on these areas to the best extent possible.
Georgia?
Yeah.
What kind of notice goes out when somebody wants to add a pier or change a pier? I mean, who gets noticed?
Abutters within 300 feet. So it's the same thing, and that could
Same.
be across the water. If you're in
Across
a
the
really,
water.
300 feet in every we make a radius of 300 feet. So, and that's typical for every NOI. What we also added is that the harbor master must review and provide written comment on each proposal. He does that now, but we wanted to put in writing so people know that's really the first part of that. Before you even come to the meeting, you need to consult with Chris. Chris and I have done a number of site visits together before people even apply, and that's really helpful.
They need to consult with the harbor master before they file the NOI?
Or before they at least come to the hearing. They don't have to, but it's before the commission issues a decision, there needs to be comment from
He
Chris.
needs to review.
Yeah.
Is that within his authority to do that as a harbor master?
Yeah, and I think that's where we say he's just providing comment. So I think in the comment letters we get from him, it's not saying the applicant must reduce by 150 linear feet. It's the commission should consider the applicant reducing it. So his authority isn't to require things, but it's really his
Recommend?
recommendation, yeah.
Yeah.
And the last one is, so these yellow lines depict the correct angle. So I think we've talked about it a couple times of the pie shape effect. Everyone kind of angles their pier the way they want to orient it when they look at it from their house, or they think they're orienting it to the channel. But really that ends up, the last guy of the pie piece gets cut off. So in this example, can you guys see the yellow lines?
Yeah.
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 So typically what we see, like for example, this one, they follow their property lines out straight like this. But what we want every time is a 90-degree angle from the property line to the channel. And it's a little hard here because our channel isn't straight, it meanders. But the intent here is if everyone is perpendicular to the channel, then we're not gonna have that pie piece.
Yeah.
So this is an example of a good one. They went
You've got a
straight
straight
out.
line coming along there, so it's easier, right?
Exactly, yeah. I mean, this curve would be a little hard. Luckily, that's the pump station, so no one's gonna be putting a pier in there. But you can see a little of where that encroachment kind of happens. And the intent here, if the person had gone straight up, then everyone is afforded kind of the same length and distance.
So those yellow lines are not the lot lines?
They are not.
Okay.
It's
Uh,
perpendicular to the
yeah.
channel,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I forgot what I was
But
gonna
when they
ask.
come off with the pier, within the width of their frontage, do they have to select a point like in the middle part of their frontage, pretty
So-
much?
I didn't have it up here, but one of the regulations is the pier must be placed as center of the lot as possible.
Okay.
So you want it in center of the lot, perpendicular to the channel. So even if your property, like this guy, his property, if what he did was follow his property line and the way his lot is angled, but it really doesn't match up with the channel.
No?
Right.
So that's, really, these are intended for the engineers and the designers doing the plans. Once
Okay,
they,
so the perpendicular to the channel, that's part of the proposed regulations.
yeah.
I like that.
And
Yes.
again, that's what we saw a lot in
The more
other,
we have in black and white, the
Okay.
better.
Yeah.
Question, if,
Yeah.
for Mr. Crooked there,
yep.
when the regulations come out, he'll have to adjust. Is
No,
that-
he won't.
No? Okay,
But if he
He
came
applies for a
back
new
and
one.
wanted to modify
Came
his
back.
pier.
okay.
Exactly,
All right,
yeah.
okay, just
Then
checking.
we
Yeah.
have them.
Yeah.
Just checking. All
Well,
right.
that's gonna be pretty much it for all of these, right? I mean, if something's existing, we're not really gonna
No,
go after them.
and,
But
yeah,
something that's new has to meet these requirements.
exactly. So like, for example, here, there's 2 houses here that don't have piers down there.
Mhm.
We're gonna wanna make sure they're angled correctly
Yeah.
at the center of the lot.
Right.
It was a little wonky for me in Microsoft Paint, so they may look a little crooked, but. And one of the biggest things at the front of the new regulations, there's a sentence that we put in there that said each property will be considered on a case-by-case basis, which I think is different than a lot of our other boards, like the planning board or the zoning board. They're using one bylaw and looking at everything the same. But for Conservation Commission, especially when it comes to piers and tidal influence and property lines and where they're situated on the water, each property is different. And the more piers we get, there may be scenarios where someone physically can't build one, or they can't build it as long as they wanted to because someone across the water had already built it longer, or their neighbors are already too close. It may just be a tough luck situation.
Right.
Yeah,
All about the math.
yes. So our size, and a lot of these are what we already have. So no wider than 4 feet, that's what we have now, 6 by 20. Floats cannot exceed, we already have that. We do not have the 200 square feet limit, so that's what we're proposing to implement strictly. And then 5 feet above mean high water, that's what we have now. I thought this was a good diagram showing at low tide, so here's mean low water. So it's really low tide here. You need that 5 feet of access so people can fish, fowl, navigate, walk along the shore. I think we talked about that in depth for the Jacob's Landing one, doing that math, making sure even at high tide,
Right.
they still had 5 feet.
So if we're using the 200 square feet and you're using 6 foot, so you're talking about lengths of around 33 feet if they use the 6 foot? I mean, for 200 square feet?
Yeah, or you could also have a configuration of a 6 by 10.
Which is only 60.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So your landing float could be 6 by 10, and then you have another 6 by 20, whatever configuration you want to
Oh.
make up your 200, but that, the
So you
length
could
can't exceed 20.
Combine, you
Yeah.
could combine?
Usually what we see is a 6x10 landing float, and then the remainder is just one big float.
Oh.
And I think now, from what I've seen, some people have had some funny float numbers, keeping it within that 200. They'll have like an 18.5 by an 11.6 or something
Are the
like
floats
that.
custom made, or is there standard sizes?
I think there are standard sizes, which is a 6x20, but we have seen some custom floats. I think you can either cut them in half or add a little bit of length. But at our town marina, it's all 6x20s.
So so that's 120 square feet, right? Do we want to go to 240? Do we think that's a good idea?
Why?
Well, just because then they could have two
To have two
standard size.
6x20?
There must be different sizes, there has to be.
Yeah, no, they definitely have, but I can find out the typical, I can ask Chris what's the typical size we see.
Yeah, see if he thinks there'd be pushback on that.
Yeah. I will say for Mead Street, or Choate and, well, Choate was never permitted, but Chevalier and Doty, they agreed to 6x20, or 200 square feet.
Okay.
That seems to be more sufficient to just, for one boat and maybe a ski-doo or,
Maybe they'll use less too.
yeah.
Bill, you gonna ask a question?
I brought it up the other night. Is there a regulation on the type of material used for the piling? The creosote
Yes,
logs or aluminum or steel,
Yep.
something other, it's not detrimental to the land or the water, like the creosote one?
Yeah.
Is it in the standard?
so it is a standard in our regulations. It's not on my slide, but we basically say materials that leach or have certain, like you had just said, creosote or chemicals in them cannot be used. Typically, what we are seeing with the timber piers, they do not have that material. Yeah. I haven't seen a steel piling yet, though, but I'm waiting for that to come.
They want to get it in the ground.
They may.
Georgia, on
Yeah.
on the floats, are there, I was out on the boat, on the water yesterday, I noticed some floats have a smaller surface area in contact with the water, so there's spots where you can see through.
Yep. I have a feeling it's like this one.
Um,
So this is the best picture I could get of,
But is there a higher standard one that would want to require? Just for the sake of having less surface area on the water and less shade being cast on the mud?
I think there could be, but is it doable? I'm not sure.
If it's doable from the point of a regulation, or?
Doable from physically achieving as much. Are you saying to make it higher? Or have less?
Right, no, I'm just saying, I noticed that there were different floats on the water.
Yeah,
Is one better than the other from our perspective, where we want to see less shading and less contact with the mud?
yes. So this is what we want to see, and I'm hopefully you guys can all see it, but this is the bottom of the float right here, but you can see there should be, this license requires 30 inches underneath. And it's almost a really small pier piling. It's like a 4x4 leg that has a small base at the bottom. So only that is sitting on the mud. That is preferred. That's what the Army Corps recommends and DMF recommends. We do have a lot of scenarios in the river, especially for those licenses that were issued in the 90s, and people are just setting it and forgetting it. They don't want to make any changes. They're happy with what they have. We see the actual float part underneath the float sitting on the mud, and that's what we don't want.
So in the language here where it says the use of helical anchors for securing floats is discouraged, all alternative methods should be considered, does that deal with what you're talking about now, or something?
No, that's a little different.
Just to secure them?
Yeah, so to go back, because I don't think I covered that, the bottom one here, helical anchors are another way to anchor your float to the ocean ground. So when it's high tide and that float's floating, so it doesn't float away, it's held by a chain, and then the helical anchor is like a screw.
Yeah, I can
It screws into
picture
the
it.
mud. Usually what we typically see is a huge anchor ball, or just, a massive thing of concrete that's dropped with a chain attachment. That's not going anywhere. DMF prefers the helical anchors because it has less coverage on the tidal flats or on the mud. But from talking to Chris, he does not like helical anchors because when you screw them in, that part that you're tying the chain to gets covered in mud, and it's really hard to inspect. And it's really hard to see what the condition is of the chain link. And he's had some instances where he can't tell if it's compromised or not, and sometimes they snap off, and then now the helical anchor's buried, and you can't get to it.
Well, that's good, because I didn't know the reason. So the reason really is not whether it's, whether it does the job, but it's difficult to inspect.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I had put in there originally that helical anchors were prohibited, but I did not want that language to go against what DMF recommends, is they would prefer to see those.
Yeah.
So in those we don't see helical anchors a lot because there's also not a lot of people that install them. There's only a few, 1 or 2 installers, and they would have to come down from Maine. And it's not like our average mooring guy is doing helical anchors. It's kind of a newer thing that we don't see a lot of people propose.
Why does the DMF like them? Just because they're less disruptive to the floor?
Exactly. It's not, instead of a huge concrete block sitting on the ground, it's
Like
just
a corkscrew.
Yeah, yeah. So it's less impact to the mud. You guys are asking really good questions.
Well, I suppose there could be a way to design it so it could be inspected, readily inspected, you know.
There, you would think, but
Yeah.
again, we go back to Danvers and how much mud we have. I'm
Yeah.
sure helical anchors are great in the sandy communities or
Yeah,
people that
yeah.
have less mud substrate, but here
The
in
other thing is,
Danvers,
if people really want them, let them come to us and try to convince us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right, yeah.
yes, Bill?
Well, they'd be coming in with a DMF
Are they
recommendation.
instructed to cleaning
Right.
up the channel?
You mean dredging?
I'm sorry, dredge.
Yeah. So we have a blanket condition, which Chris always puts in his comments, and now we're proposing it permanently, that just says if you have tackle, piers, anything permanent that impedes the dredge cut, you need to remove it at your expense, and then you can put it back. So I think there's one marina that has a lot of their floats that are within the dredge cut, so to say. They know they have to take them all out. You may even have to remove a pier piling, and then after the dredging, you can drill that back in. And
How often do we dredge?
last time we did was 2007, 2006, and I think the next time we will maybe 2027, 2030. So it's not a lot.
And there'll be environmental issues associated with that when they dig everything up.
Exactly. I think one of the hardest parts of dredging is where you put the
Where to
dredge
put the
material.
Yeah.
You get it from both ends.
Right.
So the last time when the commission officially adopted their pier regulations, we had long conversations about how high the floats needed to be off the mud. We went 24, 18, 12, 30. We went back and forth, back and forth. So
I think that was
this PowerPoint's incorrect. I kept it the same in the regulations. So last year, 2 years ago, the commission had said, all right, 18 inches if you don't have shellfish, 24 inches if you do. This does say 12 and 30, because I wanted to consider that, but I think after the discussion the commission had, and it seemed like those numbers worked best, and we do see people achieving the 18 and the 24, that I'm suggesting that we just keep it. So that language is not changed. Apologies that it's that way on the PowerPoint, it should not be. So that language is just gonna carry over. And if the commission remembers, a part of keeping that height and confirming it was, there's a couple steps. Once someone installs their floats, they're supposed to call me and say, all right, Georgia, my floats are in. I have them elevated at 18 inches. They're supposed to take a picture, and I need to come out there at low tide to just confirm. And that happens once a year for the first 3 years.
Because they settle.
Exactly, they settle. Chris Sanborn was actually, there's really not a lot of inventions, or there's really not a lot of ways to keep the floats elevated besides what we call elephant legs, or just the wood with the small board at the bottom. But Chris had some good ideas about maybe having a metal pipe that almost holds them up. I made a couple calls around to a few coastal engineers to just say, hey, how do you Have you used any other methods? Or how do you keep floats elevated above if you don't have piers to have attached to it, like a collar stop? Or so there's definitely some more methods, but right now it seems the float legs work the best, especially in Danvers.
Is that what the other communities do that are similar?
Yeah. And that's usually what we see on the Chapter 91 licenses.
Or they could do the collars on pilings, too.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. But then we get into a scenario where now it's more pilings, or the homeowner can't afford that many pilings, or that's not what they envisioned, or now we're pile driving more. It's kind of finding that middle
Balance.
You
ground.
would probably need 4, right? Like 1 for each corner. You
Yeah.
couldn't really put
Exactly.
it on fewer.
No, because then it would be like, it'd be bending over. Yes. All right, this is my last slide. These are the standard conditions, so anytime anyone gets an order of conditions for a pier, these are in the order no matter what. And these are our standard ones. We've copied them from Chapter 91. The only thing that has changed, which I think is probably the biggest one, is the first one. So our zoning bylaw has a floodplain overlay district that basically says if you're near the floodway or you're in land subject to flooding, you need to pull a building permit if you're gonna do X, Y, and Z. Build a structure, build a garage, move loam around, change the grades of things. Traditionally in Danvers, piers have never needed a building permit. They've never gone to the building inspector. They've never gone to the zoning board for anything. And I think they should be reviewed by the building inspector, not for the sound material, but this requires that an elevation certificate is provided. So it basically says, hey, we're building this pier in line with our flood regulations. It's the way it's stabilized, or if there were to be a flood, it's not gonna float away. It's not changing the way the water may come in. Like if you look at Tibbetts, if there were to be a flood, is this adding more flood water? Is it bringing more flood water onto land? So with this requirement, now all applicants are gonna have to file with the building department.
And before, they didn't have to submit a building plan?
No.
So no plans are submitted? So how do they base whether it's a good structure or not?
Us.
Oh, yeah, but we're not building inspectors.
Yeah. Yeah.
But now that's changing.
But now that's changing, and they need to have an engineer. They'll submit the same plans they give to us. And I will say, a lot of the piers, they have the structural engineer plans showing that the trusses are gonna work, it's gonna hold the weight, and the people installing the piers aren't gonna install them unless they have, engineered plans from specific dock companies. So there is coverage on health or safety of these piers, but traditionally they've never needed a building permit, or the building inspector's never gone out and closed out a pier, or no, it's
Right.
built right. But this will require it, and it will require an elevation certificate, or at least a flood professional is gonna sign off on it and show that it's not gonna impact the floodway.
And then are they allowed to bring power out to their piers?
Yeah.
And do they have to go to the electrical inspector for that?
No, unless you're digging a new line, but a lot of the times they're above surface. They use an extension cord.
Oh, yeah.
If you wanted to run legit shore power, but a lot of people just use extension cords coming off the house.
And one other thing, so when we talked about that minimum distance at 12 or
Yeah.
18, whatever it's gonna be, when the float is put upland, when it's removed, what do you see? The tops of these,
The float legs are actually attached to the float.
oh, they're part of the float
They're a part of it.
itself.
So you have the float here, and then the leg comes down with a small base, like a square block. Because if it was just the leg, it would sink right in.
Yeah,
But you get a little bit more surface area by having a square at the bottom.
I get it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And then I'm sure everyone's seen these, but these are required. So one other thing that we put in there is that Chris really was adamant on having 3-inch block letters on the pier. So when we're driving by on the boat, it has the address, the Chapter 91 license, and then also these signs are put on both sides to inform people, hey, you can go up and over, or underneath this pier. You're legally allowed to. You're not encroaching. And then we have this one, storing the floats in upland areas. And then following time of year restrictions set by DMF. So those are really our 4 standard. Before they used to include what Chris would recommend, which is the 200 square feet or not impeding on the navigable channel. And now we're trying to cater that language to be more permanent.
Now, some people store their floats in the river in the winter.
Yes.
How does, that would not be allowed under a project that comes to us for approval?
No, it would. If they have an area if they have a mooring in the channel, they can absolutely still use that. But we're saying if you take them off, you can't just store them right on the bank. They need to be in front of the house or somewhere off-site. Like for Tibbetts, for example, you can't just store them on your front lawn in front of the water.
Okay. So those that are stored in the water, they're attached to a mooring anchor?
Yeah.
So do they have to buy a mooring, rent a mooring?
Yeah, I would assume that the people that are putting their floats on the moorings are the same people that have their boat on that mooring during the summer season, and then they put the boat in storage, and then they move the float to the mooring.
Through the winter?
Yeah, yep. Not a lot of places or residents have their floats out all year long, but there are a couple that do attach them to moorings.
Well, how
yeah.
does that jive with this language that floats must be stored in upland areas?
So what I can do is change it in, if floats are not being stored in a mooring in the waterway during
Oh, I
winter
see,
months,
yeah.
then you
Yeah.
need to have them in upland. Yeah,
You'll
I'll add a little provision there for a mooring.
tweak the language a
Yeah.
little.
That is a good
All right.
suggestion, though.
And by upland area, so you mean basically out of any resource area? So in riverfront, they'd have to be more than 200 feet away? Is that what you're getting at with that?
That is a good point. So we should cater that to say maybe the first 50 feet or 100 feet. That's definitely something we should talk about, what the commission would want to consider. What would be a good length? Because you look at the houses on Tibbetts, some of them are only 80 feet long. Like, the whole lot's only 80 feet.
Yeah.
So maybe 35 or 50 would be
Hmm.
doable. It depends. I'll let the commission consider that one.
Okay. Yeah, because I feel like the use of upland is like
Yeah.
opposite of
Opposite of wetland,
wetland.
yeah. No,
But
that's a
it's
great
like-
point. That language could be really restrictive, which we obviously don't want to be too restrictive. And that's it. We did it.
All right, you know what? You did a great
Oh,
job.
thanks, Mike.
You were really prepared.
So Georgia, this is,
You didn't wing it, I mean, you really had it nailed.
Got those facts.
this is all for pretty much new projects to come in front of us.
Exactly. Or, for example, that Mead Street one. If someone comes in with this and they have a license, it's technically, it's a new project to us, but the license exists, they would have to follow the rules.
They'll have to follow through with
Yeah.
the license.
So we're not actively going after people that aren't matching these new
Right.
regulations. They'll be grandfathered in, so to say.
And if someone comes in with a proposal, and I think we did this on Riverside at one time, and their proposal says that the boat was gonna rest in mud, we can say, no, you can't do that with a new project.
We could, but I will preface that I think that could be skirting on an area that could be really over-restrictive for some
How did
owners.
Well, part of the
How
problem.
were we able to do that on that Riverside Ave project?
I think the applicant may have even offered to. I mean, I think the conversation came up, but there's nothing in the regulation that talks about vessels or boats. That was one area we didn't want to get too deep into too soon. I think
So-
traditionally boats have sat in the mud. Our first thing was to address the floats and make better piers and better float systems. Because they could sell the house tomorrow and the next guy doesn't have a boat. Or now there's this massive boat lift. And I think it may be over costly for some of our applicants.
Right.
And I think partly the problem too is if you say you can't put your boat on the mud, they're like, okay, well, I need an additional 80 feet to
Exactly.
get to permanent water.
That's exactly, Vanessa,
That's
that's
what they
kind of the
rent a
issue we
mooring.
were getting in. Yeah,
Or
Okay,
80 or more, or
Yeah.
who knows what.
could be 150 feet.
Yeah.
okay, so,
Lights this river.
you had a timeline up there, Georgia?
Yes, I'll put that back up. So that was, like I said, I presented to the River Committee last weekend, or last Thursday. You guys were tonight. And I was really aiming for September 28th is where we could have a conversation about
Great.
changing some of the if you guys had opinions on changing length or the upland wording, I can look at that. And that will be advertised in the Danvers Herald, so the public's aware, they can attend. I'll also be sending it around to some of our usual consultants like Bill Manuel and Bob Griffin for their feedback. I think they have a good understanding of homeowners and budgeting and kind of what's doable from an engineering standpoint, so getting their feedback, I think, is helpful too. And that was
So,
all.
based on this discussion, there's changes you're gonna make to the proposed regulations?
Yeah, I'll definitely make some tweaks on what you guys had suggested tonight. And then if you think of anything over the next month, ideas, questions, we can do that.
Well, will you be able to get us a document that we're gonna be voting on that we could review for
Yeah,
a few
definitely.
weeks before?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, good.
good.
This is a
And
step in the right direction.
Even if we get to the 28th and we find out you guys have a lot more comments, we can just continue the hearing to October 11th. You know, as long as the hearing's opened, we could close it at the next meeting if it sounds like there's some more stuff that needed to be changed. That's substantial.
Okay,
All right.
all right, good. Thank
Hey,
you.
thank you very much, guys.
Good job.
Oh,
All right.
Okay, the last order of
Never been up here.
business.
I just realized that.
Wow.
We had two sets of minutes at the last meeting that we wanted to approve. I'm presuming everyone has read those now, and then there was another meeting's minutes added as well, the 7:13,
Right.
which was a lengthy meeting, so that was a good read. So, is everyone reviewed, and if so, if someone can make a motion that we accept those, unless there's edits that someone needs to suggest?
I don't have an edit.
I'll make a motion that we accept the minutes for June 8th, 2023, June 22nd, 2023, and July 13th of 2023.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, is there any other business, Georgia, that we need to consider?
Nope.
No? All right, if someone can make a motion to adjourn?
Oh, Bill's gonna make.
Bill will. Yeah.
You just say so moved.
Okay.
And I'll move we adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay,
Got the eye in there, Ann.
Michael, I won't be here at the next meeting, so
All right.